The Columbus Day storm of 1962 was playfully nicknamed the Big Blow, which sounds exactly like something you'd hear out of either Seattle or Portland. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, now in its second year from the Weather Network in Canada. But it was actually originally called Typhoon Frida. It is estimated to have been the most damaging windstorm on record west of the Cascade Mountains on this day in weather history. If the Pacific Northwest is renowned for anything, it has to be its beautiful vistas, the rise of the grunge music era, and powerful windstorms. After all, in the Northern Hemisphere, systems move west to east, so the West Coast is the impact point of everything that comes from across the Pacific. The Northwest is that goofy place where the warmer waters from the south blend with the much, much colder waters from the US-Canada border through Alaska to the north. So, as you can imagine there, things can get pretty hairy at times. This powerful Pacific Northwest windstorm beat down the west coast of Canada and the Pacific Northwest coast of the United States on October 12th of 62, this day in weather history. The winds soared to hurricane force, packing gusts that surpassed 100 miles per hour or 160 kilometer per hour threshold. It wreaked havoc along this coastal region that was at this time primarily in the forestry, logging, lumber, and paper industry. And the fierce winds blew down over 3.5 billion board feet of timber, while also severely disrupting communications due to downed power lines. Welcome to year 2 of this podcast. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider, but there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective, but oftentimes they will include visuals from that day's event from when it happened in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. And just to dovetail from that if I can, I'd like to remind you where you can catch this podcast if you might be picking this up off our site or from within a story. You can look up or ask for This Day in Weather History, wherever you normally listen to your favorite podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Alexa, and now every day on yahoo.ca. As far as relevance, the Big Blow is considered one of the most powerful extratropical cyclones recorded in the U.S. in the 20th century with respect to wind velocity. It is more powerful than the March 1993 storm of the century and the 1991 Halloween nor'easter, which was also known as the perfect storm. This storm definitely ranks among the most intense to strike the region since at least 1948, and possibly going back as far as January 9th of 1880. That was the Great Gale that brought a snowstorm with it. In total, the Columbus Day storm of 1962 was linked to 46 fatalities in the Northwest and Northern California, resulting from heavy rain and mudslides. And it made that big blow on October 12th of that year. It was this day in weather history. Hey, do you like the podcast? We'd love to hear from you. If you have an idea, go right now to wherever you're listening to me and rate us if you would, please. It's on a 5-star system, and we would love as many stars as you can afford. So rate us, but then also review us. This way we can always stay on top of how you'd like to see the show evolve. Then remember to subscribe to this podcast. Click the subscribe or follow button right there on the very same podcast homepage you're listening on. You'll be immediately reminded that the next day is ready to listen to, and you also have access to every episode in the archives. It dates back to June 1st of 2020, so there is a lot that we got to get caught up on this day in weather history. Tomorrow is October 13th. Our Weather Network studios are just west of Toronto and not much more than an hour and a half from the western New York border with the Canadian town of Fort Erie. Boy, oh boy, did they ever get hammered with an early snowfall back in 2006. Tomorrow, I'll tell you about a storm that resulted in Buffalo, New York TV and radio news employees being ordered to stay the night because the National Guard needed to be deployed to remove, well, enough snow that would make it necessary to call in the National Guard, to remove it. And it happened on October 13th of 2006, on this day in weather history with me, your host, Chris May.